In the last tutorials, I introduced you to Nebulum's Mapbox plugin, and I showed you at a top level all of the incredible things that this plugin can do, including things like allowing you to create beautiful street view maps, routing or logistic maps, maps with dynamic markers on them, satellite maps, and even 3D terrain maps. Now, what we're going to do in this tutorial is we're going to learn how to set the initial location of a map, both statically and dynamically, so that it shows up how and where you want it to on page load. So in order to follow along, obviously you're going to have Nebulum Mapbox plugin installed. I've linked to this plugin below, or you can just search for it in the plugins tab by searching for Nebulum Mapbox, and it will show up right here. Now, keep in mind that there are a couple of API keys that you need to set up before this plugin will work, but I cover how to do that in the first two tutorials in the series. So both of those tutorials I've linked to below. So in today's tutorial, what we're going to do here is we're just going to first obviously begin by ensuring that we have the map added to our canvas. And if you don't, just simply search for map over here and then add Nebulum's Mapbox map element onto your canvas. Once that's done, what we're going to do next is we're going to set the initial location of this map. Now, this will be the location of the map that's set when the page is first loaded. So we can do this through the plugin properties interface here. Now, notice that under the initial map position subheading, you'll see these input fields for initial latitude as well as initial longitude. Now, one thing that's important to realize here is that mapping software will always require these coordinates to work. Mapping software uses these coordinates under the hood to accurately display location. Now, as humans, obviously, we prefer to use human-readable names of places or addresses. So I'll show you an approach in a moment which will allow you to convert human-readable addresses to mapping coordinates. Okay, so let's refocus on our mapping plugin here. Now, personally, I always like to test that the map is working step by step. So let's begin by adding a couple of hard-coded values into these fields here. So below this video in the description, I've added the latitude and longitude coordinates of some famous locations around the world, so you can use these values for your own testing. So the first thing I'll do here is I'll add the values for the Empire State Building. And then what I'll do is I will go into the front end and I will just reload my page. Now, as you can see, the map zooms into this location on page load. Now, if we wanted the default zoom to be closer in, we could set the initial zoom number to a higher number, like 15, for example. Now, keep in mind that street view is typically somewhere around 15 to 17. Alternatively, if we wanted our default zoom to be more zoomed out, we could just set this to a smaller number, for example, like 5, 7, or 9. Also, remember that this is just the standard map view style that we're working with right now, but the same logic applies if, for example, we changed our map style to something like dark. As you can see, if I did that and then went back into my front end and then refreshed my page, the same logic applies to different styles. However, for now, I'm just going to set this back to standard style for this tutorial. Okay, so now we know this is working. However, very rarely will we ever be hard coding values into these fields here. These initial location values will almost always be searched for in our database. Not only that, but almost never do people know the latitude and longitude coordinates of a location. Now, as we already talked about, people tend to want to search for a location by the location's address or name. So let me teach you how to do both of these things. So first, let me show you how to store a location's lat and long coordinate values from a simple location address or name lookup. So let's add a search field onto our page here, and we'll just call it search box Nebulum maps. And then we'll ensure its choice's style is set to geographic places. And then next, we'll add 3 basic input fields onto our canvas here. Now, in our first input field, we'll set the initial value to search for Nebulum maps value, and then we'll select this option for formatted address. In the next field, we'll set this initial value to search box Nebulum maps value latitude. And in the last one here, we'll set this one to search box Nebulum maps value, and then we'll select this option for longitude here. Now, if we were to go back into our front end and refresh our page and we were to type in something like Empire State Building in this search field here, as you'll see, once you click out, these values here populate with the intended lat and long values as well as the address, which you see right here. Now, if you don't see any of these values show up here, it's likely because you haven't set up your Google API key yet, and that's the topic that I discussed in the previous tutorial in this series. So if you're not seeing any values show up here, just ensure that you've watched that tutorial and gone through those necessary steps. It only takes a couple of minutes. So for the rest of you, we should be seeing these values now, which we can obviously store to our database. So if I added a button here, what we could do is we could simply create a new thing in the database and map our input fields to the appropriate database field types. Now, keep in mind that latitude and longitude values will always be numerical. So when you're creating these values in your database, you should always set the data type here to number. So for example, here in my database, I have a simple data type called locations, and each location has a few fields. So first there is address, which is a geographic address. Now, with just this address, we could extract the lat and long values from any location in our database, but we could also just add the lat and long values like I've done here and then save them as the number data type. Lastly, I've added this name field here, which is just data type text, which just allows me to save my location name. So for example, the pyramids or Empire State Building and so on. So I've actually added a couple of locations into my database here just for testing. So my last item in my database here are the coordinates for the pyramids. And the first, which you see right here, are the coordinates for the Empire State Building. So now let's search for this data dynamically in our front end. So let's go over here. And now what we'll do is we'll do a search for, and then we'll simply search for the last item in our database, and we'll select that item's latitude. Then what we'll do is we'll just copy that expression and paste it here and change lat to long. Now, if we go back into our front end and refresh our page, we'll see the pyramids show up here. Alternatively, let's change this in our back end from last item to first item. And now what will happen when we go back into our front end and refresh our page, what it will do is it will now call on the first item from our database, which in my case, remember, was the Empire State Building. And as you can see here, when I refresh my page, the map zooms into the Empire State Building. So we always need to set the initial position of our map in our plugin. This essentially tells the map where to start out or where to begin. Now this could be hard-coded, it could be a dynamic value like we just used, or it could actually even be the live location of a user. Now I'm actually going to talk about live location in the next video in the series, but for now I just want to continue working with these more basic examples. So imagine right now that we're defaulting to the Empire State Building. But imagine that we want people to be able to navigate around the map by clicking on other locations or buttons within our application. So for example, let's imagine that we want people to reset this map view to, for example, the Statue of Liberty when they click on a card or a button that represents the Statue of Liberty. Now to do this, we could use a couple of options. We could use the fly to or pan to actions within a workflow. So let's add a button here, and then what I'll do is I'll add the pan to coordinates option in the workflow section here. Now this option and the fly to address option are very similar. The main difference really is the animation. Now if you're jumping a long distance, so for example, say from the Empire State Building in New York to the Eiffel Tower in Paris, you might want to use the fly to option. The animation for the fly to option will first zoom out, it will travel then across a long distance, and then it will zoom back in to your desired zoom level. Now the pan to coordinates option is generally a better animation to use when you're just jumping small distances because it just pans, it doesn't zoom in or out. So for example, you probably use pan to if you were just simply trying to navigate to a different neighborhood within the same city. In our case here, all we need to do is just add our lat and long coordinates here. And then now when we click on this button back in our front end, the map will animate the transition between this location and pan smoothly to the next location. So play around with these options here within your own application. Remember, you can use either the fly to option or the pan to option. So that's all I have for you for this tutorial. Again, if you don't already have it installed, be sure to install Nebulum Mapbox Maps plugin, which is the plugin that I was using in this tutorial, by simply searching for the plugin within your app and then installing it. Also remember that this is only the third tutorial in a multi-part tutorial series on mapping within Bubble. Next, we're going to be talking about how to set up live location and live tracking within your Bubble app. A link to the next tutorial in the series can be found below. Thanks for stopping by today.